The following is an interview with deVries. She has been at the University of Utah for decades working as a pediatric urologist, and most recently, her work has focused on global surgery. She is well known for her groundbreaking work in the area of global urology and was the founder of IVUMed, or the International Volunteers in Urology. I was interested in hearing about her insights on a career spanning decades of change in surgery and in global urology. I knew her to be someone with a unique path and an insightful perspective on modern surgery. I was interested to hear about this path in the context of constructing the second half of my career, and thought others would also enjoy the conversation. Catherine spends the majority of her time on a ranch in Wyoming, just over the border from Utah, with her husband Scott. I started my 2-hour journey from Salt Lake City to the edge of the high Uinta Mountains, where the ranch is positioned. We spent the first hour of the morning on a tour of Catherine and Scott's ranch. Catherine showed me multiple areas of their working ranch, including the barn where they often host weddings of their friends and family, the tack room, and stables for their horses, and areas where they bring their cattle when cows are ready to give birth. They own about 400 acres and run approximately 50 head of cattle. One heifer had just given birth and the calf was just standing on very wobbly legs for the first time. The tour culminated with their recent remodel of a guest house that was an environmentally sealed structure that Catherine and her husband had completely done on their own, heated solely by elements in the flooring. We sat down in this guest house for our conversation about Catherine's career. Well, I really appreciate you doing this interview. Like I said, I don't know what will come of this, but I thought I had lots of questions and thought it would just be really interesting and fun for me to talk to you about your career. And I know that there are a number of people out there that would be really interested to hear about it as well. So I wanted to ask you kind of first question, how did you get involved in medicine? I know your dad was a pediatric surgeon of some renown, or a well-known pediatric surgeon.
Yeah, well, I didn't start off wanting to be in medicine. I had seen his life, and he was the first pediatric surgeon west of the Rockies, so he was not around a lot. And I was always interested in the things he was interested in, though. I mean, if it was roadkill, I wanted to dissect it. It was, I was interested in the way things worked. But the lifestyle of being, dropping everything whenever an emergency happened, just didn't seem congruent with whatever I might want to do in the future. And, in that time, he was called for any cardiac problem, burns, 4th of July, kid would have a cherry bomb explode in his hand, they'd get a turkey bone on Thanksgiving, you name it, he'd go. So until my 20s, I really had excluded medicine as a thing I wanted to do, but I did know that I wanted to be outdoors a lot. So the kind of life that I'm living now is the kind of life I imagined in my 20s.
Where was it that you grew up, where you practiced? Did you move around, or did you live in one place?
We moved around a lot, but we're always in the Bay Area.
Okay.
So every 2 years I went to a different school. And the longest I've ever been anywhere is Utah. I've been here for 24 years, so that's a total record. Prior to that, I'd never been anywhere for more than 5 years.
Was it just that your father was moving jobs and moving communities, or?
Yeah. So he was in private practice. And then a lot of the time he was in private practice, but also part of academics. So he was affiliated with Stanford when Stanford was in San Francisco, and then it moved down to the farm. And he did a lot of different things, All it was a pediatric surgery, but he was in San Francisco. He was born and raised in San Francisco. So, it's one of sort of the old guys of San Francisco.
Did he train in the San Francisco area or California?
He went to Stanford and Berkeley, and then he went to Michigan to train.
Okay.
He did general surgery at Michigan and then went to Boston Children's. He was one of Robert Gross's very first pediatric surgery fellows.
It's really interesting that you mentioned not wanting to go into medicine, because I had really similar experience.
Really?
Because I don't know if we've talked about this, but my mother was an internist and she trained at Harvard. Mm-hmm. She was one of 5 women in her class, and there were 2 women that had children. She was one of them.
When did she train?
She finished, I think, in 1976.
Mm-hmm.
1977.
She finished med school then, or?
Med school.
Okay. I graduated there from undergraduate in 77.
Oh, really? No
Mm-hmm.
kidding. I didn't realize you had gone to Harvard.
I went to several different ones, but I ended at Harvard.
Uh-huh.
I needed some school that sounded like I wasn't in flaky California, having been to 4 or 5 other schools. So fortunately they let me in, and then people don't ask questions about, where did you start and how did you get where you got. The questions stop and you don't have to give the long answer.
Intrigued, and then
Catherine reflected on
and I really
how
loved it.
she started to get interested in medicine after initially thinking it was not a lifestyle that she wanted, after watching her
graduate
dad's
school, really.
career trajectory.
And then I realized that I didn't want to be writing grants forever. I still loved the basic science, and I still love the basic science.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I like doing stuff with my hands, and I might have stayed in graduate school indefinitely, but I got married to Dana, who matched at Stanford, and then I couldn't go back to Duke. I tried to wrangle it to go back, but that didn't work out. And so I bailed on my PhD and, got into medical school at Stanford. And
How far along were you in your PhD when you...
2 years.
2 years.
Yeah, so I had finished all my... Well, I'd been doing research all along, but, the coursework I did. But at Duke, if you are a pathology graduate student, which I was, you take all of the preclinical things that the medical students do. So I had already taken all of that at Duke before I went to Stanford, and I didn't have to take much preclinical work. So I got my MD with 2.5 years of medical school.
Oh. And forgive me, I don't know where you did your training. I know we've talked about it before, but I forget your residency training.
Yeah, so I had a not very direct path to college or medicine. I actually got married when I was 18.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I got married to a guy who I used to do rock climbing with, and we were living together, but my parents disapproved, so we more or less said, okay, fine, we'll get married. And it was a bad idea all the way around, which we knew at the time, but it was basically to get our parents off our backs. And that lasted until I was about 21. But I started off at University of Colorado.
Oh, really? No kidding. In
Yeah.
Boulder?
At Boulder.
good place for rock climbing.
Yes, and which is why I went there.
Yeah.
And, you know, and we spent most of our time skiing or rock climbing, you know, so, and not paying a whole lot of attention to my grades. So, you know, I had some to make up for, you know, after my freshman year. But then we got married, and we were out of state tuition, so went back to California and went to Humboldt State.
Okay.
And I went there until it became, because I thought I wanted to be I was a forestry major.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed that most of the forestry majors ended up living in trailers at the end of a dirt road.
Mm-hmm.
And about that time my marriage was also falling apart, and I didn't see myself living in a trailer at the end of a dirt road in my future.
Yeah.
I needed more financial options.
Uh-huh.
So I rode my bicycle down from the top of California down to the Bay Area,
Mm-hmm.
and then I hitchhiked east to New York, up through Canada,
Oh, wow.
and across, and ended up in Manhattan.
Wow.
Because I'd never seen a big city, never seen a subway, didn't know anything about that. And I worked in Manhattan for about 6 months until it became really clear that I worked at Sloan Kettering, actually,
Uh-huh.
in a lab, and I also worked at the Gap. And became clear that working as a lab tech would not earn me enough money to even rent an apartment anywhere.
I asked Catherine about her father's influence on her and how she got involved in medicine, or an interest in medicine, science, and the outdoors.
My dad had done all of the basic science for that. And as a kid, I had spent a lot of time with him in the lab. And some of those microscope parts and all of that are his.
Wow.
And plus I have boxes and boxes of his old research stuff, which, you know, I sort through it now, and sometimes I can get rid of it, like the stuff in German I can't read. But anyway, you know, I can't bring myself really to get rid of all of this really cool primary research. I was his sidekick.
Uh-huh.
So we used to race sailboats and on the weekends, and then I'd do work for him.
So it sounds like you had a really close relationship with your dad.
I did.
Is he the one that got you interested outdoors? Because that's kind of unusual for someone at the time, and especially
not in California.
Okay.
So in the West, it wasn't.
Yeah.
You know, so I grew up racing sailboats with him on the bay.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we moved down to Los Gatos, when I was in high school, I got into rock climbing.
Uh-huh.
And that was my mother's doing. She signed me up with U Science Institute. And I'd go out with YSI climbing. So I started climbing when I was about 15 or 16.
I asked Catherine about what it was like growing up in the Bay Area. That's interesting.
But there was a lot of change going on in the 60s in the Bay Area. You know, that was kind of the Haight-Ashbury time.
Yeah.
You know, and there was, you know, a lot of people coming to the Bay Area. There was a lot of stuff happening. You know, I would, you know, take the Greyhound bus into San Francisco when we were living in Marin County, and you know, I had free range of the place. My parents got me a dog, and I just went everywhere.
Sounds like a pretty amazing childhood.
Yeah, you know, I liked it, but I was always kind of a wandering kid. You know, I would just leave in the morning before they woke up and show up for dinner.
Mm-hmm.
And A couple of times I got myself brought home by the police because they found a young girl walking around with a dog, you know, several miles from home and thought I was lost or something, which I wasn't.
When you finished at Stanford, where did you go to train for urology?
I stayed at Stanford. Yeah. I really liked Utah, actually. I wanted to come to Utah, but it was the first year of the match. And so Tom Stamey called me and said, you know, in his inimitable way, he said, I'd love to train you, honey, but I gotta tell you, you're not my first choice. I got this young man from Hopkins, but I can bring you on too. Thank you, Dr. Stamey. I had come out to Utah and I really liked it because it was a 5-year program and Stanford was a 6-year program. And I'd already done a lot of research and I didn't want to do another year right in the middle of my residency. Well, the first 2 years were really good. That was general surgery. You know, I had 2 kids by that time also. You know? And the reason we had the kids was because Dana had, he had been a resident in peds and he knew that it was a real bummer for everyone else to take call when somebody had to take maternity leave, and or they had a problem with their pregnancy and so everybody else had to take call. So he wanted to make sure that that did not happen during my residency. So I had them during medical school.
I asked Catherine about training back in the 1980s in urology, and she talked about her time at Stanford.
Oh, so we had 2 years of general surgery, and the second year was, you know, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I was at Kaiser, we could do everything. There was no senior resident. You know, it was just the attending and me. The day after my internship, I was doing a right hemicolectomy, and modified radical mastectomy and ectomies of all kinds. You know, this was 3 days after my internship. You know, you get to do all this big, good stuff. So yeah, it was fabulous. I still have my case log from. It was really great. But then I got to urology, and Dr. Stamey made it very clear who were his favorites, and and I wasn't.
So you did 6 years, and was it then that you knew you wanted to do pediatrics?
No. I liked oncology. I worked with a guy named Fuad Freiha, who was a master surgeon. And I really liked the big cases. But my husband, Dana, died when I was chief resident. And it became clear that I was not going to be able to do a fellowship because I had the 2 kids who were by that time 6 and 8.
Yeah.
So,
I can't imagine that.
Yeah, it was bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. I found out halfway through my chief residency year that he was addicted to fentanyl. And he would not go to rehab when I tried to get him to go to rehab, and then he was intervened on in about maybe February or so. But at that time, and this was 34 years ago, so I mean, he had plenty of access to it. But the rehab that he went to was a joke. Even I, at the time, knew that it was a joke. He hadn't made it past maybe step 3 when they let him out because insurance only covered like 6 weeks. Then he went back to work. anyhow, I was at the AUA in New Orleans, and I called home, and I got the police. So then I went to work at Kaiser.
Mm.
So, you know, on the
As a
upside.
general urologist.
Yeah. So on the upside about that is if you are at Kaiser, at least at that time, there were no specialties, and there were also no residents. So you had to learn how to do a radical prostatectomy with a tech. You know, you didn't have anyone else holding anything else for you. It was you and the tech. So if it radical cystectomy, radical prostatectomy, you named it, posterior valves, newborn with valves, whatever it was, you did it. From newborns to 90-year-olds. So, but at any rate, I was there for 4 years, but after about 2 years there, it became clear that that was going to be sort of a dead end. You know, you see the same people in the OR every day. You see the same people in clinic every day. In the, you know, going to lunch, having meetings is the same people. Same stuff. And you can project out 10 or 15 years, and if you keep doing that same stuff, it was going to get kind of boring. And besides that, I thought that I could do a lot of stuff pretty well. But I didn't feel like I was an expert in any of them, except maybe some of the technical aspects of oncology. Because we did a lot at Stanford. And, you know, I felt like I could practically do a radical cystectomy with one hand tied behind my back, but I couldn't do a vasectomy.
Yeah.
You know?
Catherine talked about her choice of fellowship and how she landed on pediatric urology.
It came down to female urology or peds. But what I liked about peds gets back to the basic science we were talking about, and all that embryology, and there was a lot of really cool basic science in peds. So I went and, you know, I wanted to do a fellowship there, you know. Of course, I had to drag the 2 little kids wherever I was going.
I have one observation that I'd love to hear your thoughts about. I think general urology now has become even more challenging in some ways because there's an increase in specialization. And some of that increase in specialization is kind of attributed to sort of grade inflation, you know, that concept that you need to have more training to be competitive. You know, now it's not enough to be a general urologist, you have to be a specialist in endourology if you want to be competitive. There's sort of that feel. But I think the actual reason for it is that the operations have just become so much more specialized. And the outcomes have become so much more specialized. There's obviously the robot, there's mini PCNL. I mean, how I learned to do PCNL is just so rudimentary and crude, you know, compared to the technology now. And so the role of being good as a general urologist is even harder now.
And yet, if you work in global surgery, it becomes important to have those general skills. And people who now specialize, they kind of branch off the trunk early on. They don't have those skills for open surgery anymore, and they can't necessarily use a laparoscope to do a mid-ureteral stone, you know. And my Vietnamese colleagues, when I ask them how they do it, because they don't have, you know, ureteroscopes, well, they just, you know, use the laparoscope. They do it laparoscopically. They open up the ureter, they pluck out the stone and, you know, put a stent.
Catherine talked about her experience in being a fellow at University of California, San Diego.
Can you tell me, so where was your fellowship? How long did it last? And then another question that I have is, coming in with 4 years of experience, I got to imagine that you
was
were
already board
an
certified.
amazing fellow.
Yeah, I was already a board certified when I did my fellowship, so they could kind of turn me loose doing most things, but then when there were good cases, I'd go scrub with him. And you know, that's why I went to do the fellowship, was to learn from the guys, the pediatric urologists. And one of the things I learned was that my complications that I had had previously were also their complications. So it sort of made me feel better because I was feeling kind of insecure about doing certain cases that I hadn't done a fellowship to do. And there weren't any other pediatric urologists in the Bay Area at the time. You know, there just weren't any.
Mm-hmm. So not at UCSF or any of those places?
Yeah, those guys were sort of training, but they didn't have fellowships. You know, Larry Baskin was a contemporary of mine, and he now has a fellowship there and has had for years. But he was a resident there when I was a resident there at Stanford. So he was in UCSF.
So it was just the general academic urologists that were doing pediatrics
Exactly.
at the time. There wasn't any specialty pediatric.
Right. I had gone to the East Coast places and interviewed, and it was very funny. Well, I thought it was kind of funny. John Duckett said he had one woman before, who was Linda Shortliff, and Linda had 2 kids also, but Linda had been working at the VA, so she hadn't been doing general urology. She had been doing VA urology, and she went to peds, you know, big from the VA to like you know, Philadelphia is a big change. Anyway. And so John Duckett takes me out to dinner and says, you know, I can't take you. And I said, why is that, Dr. Duckett? And he said, I need a young man with fire coming out his ass. And I thought, fine. So I ranked him at the bottom. And, you know, obviously I wasn't going to match there, but that's where Brent Snow and Pat trained.
Yes.
So, and I went to Harvard and I interviewed there.
At Boston Children's.
At Boston Children's. And Hardy Hendren was there, and my dad had trained Hardy Hendren. And so I got to hear about stuff, you know. And you know, I spent until 11 p.m. standing up watching Hardy do a case, you know, and at 11 p.m. we finally finished that thing, and then went, and his secretary had stayed up in order to provide refreshments. And then we went to talk to the mom, you know, this is my interview time. And I thought, dang, you know, this is not a style of living that I could
especially with
do.
kids.
You know, I mean, in the first place, I don't like it here.
I talked to Catherine about her early career as a pediatric urologist. After completing fellowship at San Diego, she spent time at University of Georgia at the Medical College of Georgia.
And then I went to Georgia, to the Medical College of Georgia, mostly because I didn't want to be somebody else's junior partner. And because it looked like a place where I could create something new. They were just building a children's hospital there.
Oh, wow.
And it looked like an interesting place. And it was the South, and I'd never lived there before, and I was curious about it.
after talking to Catherine about her training and variable road into medicine, as well as fellowship, we transitioned our conversation over to how she got involved in global surgery and global urology.
But when I did pass my boards, then I started going overseas because one of my mentors, a plastic surgeon at Stanford, was Don Laub. And Don had founded Interplast.
Okay.
And he had been working a lot in Honduras and Mexico and other countries, and everywhere they went they were seeing hypospadias and other reconstructive problems.
Mm-hmm.
And so he asked me to go along with the plastic surgeons
Mm-hmm.
to go do these things. That was sort of what I spent the whole time on the airplane coming back, trying to figure out, okay, what do we need in a set? Why are these things going wrong when they go right in the States, but they're going? And the first thing we knew we needed was good pediatric anesthesia on these kinds of trips. People who are used to doing epidurals, caudals, spinals, you name it.
Yeah.
And then there were a variety of dressings that people are used to using in the States, but then in a hot, humid environment that don't stay on, and so you need different tape, different stuff. There's just a whole bunch of elements that we had thought we had dialed in the States that just weren't working.
It sounds like you had experience with pediatrics at Kaiser, but would you say that it's really this international experience that made you want to become expert and do a fellowship in pediatrics?
Yes, it was kind of both things because, I missed the academic aspect. There was no one to ask. At Kaiser, there are other clinicians, but by and large, I've found that in private practice, a lot of people stop learning, or at least they're not as obsessively learning.
Yeah.
And I'm a bit of an obsessive learner, whether it's medicine or cows, or bees or, grass identification, whatever it is, it's been, I wake up at 2 a.m. thinking about these things. So, so this became a thing, how do we both produce in our own hands the kind of outcomes that we get, the best of the outcomes? How do we both do it and teach it?
Mm-hmm.
And then I wanted to be sure by working with other pediatric urologists that I knew as much as there is to know.
Sure. Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about, Catherine, is very much what you described at the beginning of going on Interplast trips was a very different type of trip than the IVU model that you really, I think, kind of brought out. And so that was more of a mission trip where you were bringing supplies and doing expert surgery as opposed to the evolution of the message of teaching as the primary purpose or mission of global surgery. How did that evolution take place, or was it always from the beginning?
It was partly for the beginning because we always had local surgeons working with us. And it became, so it was usually the local plastic surgeons at first because that was Interplast's network. But for urology, that wasn't going to work because even hypospadias, involves tubes and, it's not unusual to have an undescended testis or a missing testis, ovatestis, pick your thing, DSD. So you had to know some urology, and so the plastic surgeons were not interested in that. And Interplast was a plastic surgery organization built on cleft lips and palates and burns and webbed fingers and things like that. So they essentially, the board was not happy with us progressing more into urology. But during that time, we sort of transitioned into working with pediatric surgeons who were interested in pediatric urology because they would see these complex problems like cloacas and complex, pelvic floor problems that included urogenital tract and also anorectal stuff, exstrophies, and the whole big and little problems that happen.
So what was it that stimulated you or caused you to change from Georgia and come to the University of Utah?
By that time, we had incorporated IVU, and I was working at a place that had a very small airport. And the nearest hub city was Atlanta. And logistically, it was very difficult for us to do what we were doing with IVU at the time. Because then, by that time, we were working in Vietnam, so we were working in Asia, and also in Cuba, and also in Honduras, and a little bit in Africa, not much. Mostly Asia and Central America, Cuba and Honduras. And so the criteria were it had to have an airport that you could go east and west. And at that time I was also flying airplanes, so the airport part was before I gave up flying airplanes.
Oh. I didn't know you were a pilot.
Yeah. Well, I gave it up because, you can only do so many things and do them well.
Yeah.
And it's
important to fly a plane well, isn't it?
You want to fly an airplane as well as you do surgery.
Yeah.
And that takes time. And if you also have kids, and you just can't do it all. But before I got doing IVU that much, even when I went down to San Diego, I used to fly a lot. Yeah. But during that last year when I was there, I did the ELAM program, which was very good. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
It's called the Executive Leadership in Academic Medicine.
Yep.
And I did that with the intention of maybe evolving to a leadership position. I mean, the whole focus of that program is to teach you the skills you need to become, a dean or chair or something of that sort. What that program did teach me was that you lose a lot of freedom with every additional administrative level. With every new responsibility you take on, you lose dimensions of freedom, and you are accountable to more people, both upper and below. So, even if you are the university president, and I worked with our university president and the dean, and they all told me, you are accountable to the trustees, you are accountable to, the trustees plus, the various other levels of stuff. At all levels, you are accountable both above and below. And what I like about academics is the young people and their enthusiasm for learning. And what I like about teaching overseas is the enthusiasm for learning new things wherever we go, if we have something to offer that's new and valuable to other people, that aspect of it is hugely gratifying. You know why it was called IVU? It was called IVU because back in those times, people did intravenous urograms. It was sort of before you CT scans, and it was kind of a play on words for urology. People would know what that meant. Now, if you were to ask any urologist at the AUA, only the old guy would know what an IVU was.
I didn't realize that was a play on word. Yeah.
And then we went to make a website, and we wanted to be IVU, but the International Vegetarians Union had that, so we couldn't use it. So we had to call it IVUMed. And I learned from Interplast and also Operation Smile, who had been doing these things for a long time, how to pack and how to get stuff through customs. And so we developed a whole inventory of stuff that you could have on hand and you'd bring everywhere to make sure that if you were going to undertake these procedures, you would have everything from all the right tubes to do safe anesthesia on children of various sizes, from infants to adult size, and also manage the pain and all this other stuff.
Sure. One potential criticism of that approach or observation would be that maybe if you're going to places like that, they really don't have the infrastructure in order to learn those surgeries or carry out those surgeries. That's something we've talked a little bit about with GU impacts. There's maybe a separate way of thinking about it and saying there's really only some places that are training or have the basic infrastructure to really learn more advanced urology and targeting those places.
I have never bought into that for this reason. People want to know what's the best way to do a thing. They are smart, they can read, they read the literature, they know what they want even if they don't have it. They want to see it in action if you can bring it. And they are amazingly creative of getting stuff if they know what they want and need. So they might have a cousin who lives in the States, or they might have somebody who lives in India, or pick your other place. They've got their own resources. If they know that they want this scope or that pair of forceps or this kind of scissors or whatever, and that this is the way that they can get their best result.
When I was in training and got interested in global surgery, global urology, you know, one of my attendings sort of said, well, why do you want to do that? I mean, what would you respond? And certainly urologists as a group tend to be quite conservative as surgeons. And what would you say to that attitude among urologists? How would you make a counter argument that this is important beyond just personal interest?
Well, I mean, I don't think you're going to change people who have entrenched worldview of things. And the people who are of a curious and growth mindset, I think they're probably like that from the get-go as kids. And they, you know, whatever else they learn, and then they learn some more, and then they want to learn about other people's cultures, and they want to share, and they have a dynamic life. And many of those people, maybe most of those people, go into academics because it's so fluid, and you know, the residents change over time, and there are new things that come out, and there's opportunity for that kind of growth and change, which is harder to do in private practice.
If you had to think about global surgery, global urology, over the next 10 years or 15 years, what do you think the number one thing that we need to do during that time? We're on a trajectory, probably lots of ups and downs, like you sort of alluded to in your learning curve. There's ups and downs in our trajectory. What do you think we need to do in the next 10 years?
Well, the thing that excites me is that the academic centers are, that they're the old guard of guys who I love and who are more or less my age, are stepping aside and letting the younger people take leadership roles.
Mm-hmm.
And those younger people are smart and ambitious and have very good connections, a lot of which were brokered by IVU.
Mm-hmm.
And, people who kind of came through IVU as residents and who are now attendings or stuff like that. Many of them, certainly not all, but a lot of them have maintained personal relationships,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes institutional relationships, and sometimes just personal ones. And sometimes they're working with other nonprofits, but they're bringing elements. So there's been kind of a seeding of people in many places who now want to bring up the
Mm-hmm.
quality of care, and they are in positions where both in their hospitals and in their institutions they have reached a level of seniority and maturity that they now can influence doing things, both here in the States and also in Africa and Asia.
So it's adoption of global surgery as a value, as an academic leg or an academic mission that's
Right.
legitimate and something that should be pursued.
And it's not just urology. I mean, urology is way behind a lot of other things. General surgery started off behind urology, and they've blown right past it.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the professional societies, the College of Surgeons, for example, both in inclusion of women in leadership positions in their professional society, but also inclusive of engagement in other countries in Africa. You see a lot, the Association of Women Surgeons is supporting women surgeons in Africa in a big way. I mean, I love going to these meetings because they're doing scholarships and all kinds of stuff, research scholarships. They have a real engagement in supporting these people's growth in their professions and to turn them into their leaders.
On a recent hike in the mountains surrounding Salt Lake City, I reflected upon Catherine's insights into urology and her work in global surgery. She's an inspiring person who has followed her passion throughout her career. She's someone like many people in surgery with energy that was all over the place as a younger person, but clearly became focused and organized around themes that spoke to her: pediatric urology, academics, and global surgery. She talked a lot about the ranch and transitions in life and how choices or interests change over time. As she contemplates retirement from her work in global urology and surgery, she started to focus more on simple and very satisfying life she and her husband have on the ranch. Catherine was one of the reasons I came to University of Utah. I also share a passion for teaching surgery and developing programs to disseminate reconstructive urology outside of the United States. Catherine is a great example of what can be achieved by an individual with talent, passion, and drive. She's an inspiring role model for academic urology.